Alright, so I'm a little less scratchy-throated now, so we're going to continue reading. There might be more background noise in this one because the kiddos just got out of school, so there's people driving and probably coming back from work and stuff, but if you hear kids yelling, it's not anybody getting hurt, it's them playing in the church parking lot next door, I promise. I hope you're liking it so far, and I hope I'm reading it well. I'm trying to slow down because I noticed that when I was reading Bloomability it was really fast, but I have a little bit of trouble gauging that, so we'll see how it goes, but I don't want to read it too slowly either because I don't want to take an hour to read one chapter. That's just not fun. So anyways, where we left off was Arnie is gone. Raft is gone and they cannot find him. And they're not happy about it. So chapter 4. On day 13, at low tide, I went out along the coral causeway alone, wearing the reef sandals, watching carefully where I put my feet. There are some very nasty creatures that live in the holes in coral rock. It was something we did regularly, this trip, to see if more stuff had drifted in. Strange oddments kept turning up, shoes, bits of clothing. Neil Cannon's body had gone. I reached the place where it had been, and stood looking down. The water was deep beside the causeway there. You could see through the sunlit layer that it was like liquid air, into depth on depth of clear blue darkness. I shivered in the hot sunlight. Since the night of the crash, the sea had seemed like an enemy to me, a monster lying in wait, going to kill me if I ever gave it a chance. A few meters ahead, there was a dark blob, bumping against the rock. I felt sick. I thought it was a human head. Oh God, I prayed. Oh, please, don't let it be. Don't let me have to see that. It wasn't Arnie's head. It was a Planet Savers Jungle Kit water canteen, the strap waving vaguely to and fro, the cap fastened tight. I knelt down. The foamless billows lifted the canteen and gently carried it out of reach. I knew the sea was trying to lure me, but I wasn't going to be caught like that. I waited patiently, and the canteen came bobbing back. As I reached to grab it, a great long torpedo came gliding upward out of the blue. The shark turned over. It was very close. I saw its pale underbelly. The U-shaped, serrated, gummy gape of its mouth opened lazily and shut again, and then I was hugging the canteen in my arms, so terrified I don't know how I managed to get hold of it. I knelt there, feeling sick for a minute or two. Then I walked on. I knew if I lost my nerve for this reef walk once, I'd never get it back. The point which we had established as the farthest we could go, without getting trapped by the tide, was marked with a long pole. As I reached it, I found a clean blue plastic barrel floating half full of seawater. Miranda was sitting outside the shelter, splitting up some palm leaf. The three of us had been weaving ourselves sleeping mats. Miranda had taught us how. "Hi," she said quietly. "Any sign of the raft?" I shook my head. I put the canteen and the barrel down in front of her. "I saw a shark," I said. "Big one." My mouth began to tremble. I sat down beside her, and both of us started to cry. We sat there hugging each other and crying until it was time to go and cut Sunset Notch. 3 days later, we gave up searching and waiting for him and set out on the trek to the next bay. We took our sleeping mats, the extra clothes, all the food we had, and all the water we could carry. In case the search and rescue people arrived while we were away, we left a message written in pebbles on the sand above the high tide, and a big arrow of sticks and stones showing which way we had gone. It took us a day to get to the headland, and, I think, 4 days to climb it. We did a kind of imaginary version of the notch ceremony each night. We'd say we were going up to notch the tree, say who was cutting the notch, and play the tomorrow game. But we might have got muddled. We weren't writing anything down. There'd been a pencil case in one of the rucksacks, a ballpoint and the remains of a notebook in the other, and a couple of sodden paperbacks, but none of the pens would write, so we'd use all the paper for tinder once it dried out. The signal fire had seemed more important. Of course there were no tracks. We reckoned the headland was about 100 meters, or 300 feet, high. which doesn't sound like much, but it was very hard going. We ran into thickets we couldn't get through, cliffs we couldn't scale, and gullies we couldn't cross, and worst of all, we lost the compass almost straight away when I fell into a ravine. Every time we had to backtrack, we'd end up getting lost and going around in circles because we couldn't see the sign for the trees. When we reached what seemed to be the top, there was no viewpoint. We had to struggle on through ant-ridden, thorny thickets for another day, and sleep sitting up under a tree because there wasn't a piece of ground clear enough for us to lie down. The next morning, we managed to get a clear view into the northern bay. It was as empty as our own, but there was no beach. Swampy forest went right into the sea. We discussed trying to find a way down, but there didn't seem to be much point, and we really had no choice but to turn back. We'd run out of food and water. The night we arrived back in camp, which we counted as the night of day 20, there was a storm. Our shelter was wrecked, and we lost some of our most important possessions. At least the girl who waved was gone in the morning. Miranda told me the last bits of wrecked plane fuselage had gone too. Later on, we tried the southern trek. The southern headland was farther off, bigger, incredibly rugged, and totally covered in thickets with thorns like razor wire. We didn't make it to the top. We both lost our footgear. By the time we got back to camp, we both had deep, bleeding blisters, and Miranda had a huge thorn burrowed in the ball of her left foot. My sore knee, which had never gotten completely better, had swollen up again and started to ooze yellow stuff. We got the thorn out, but the wound on Miranda's foot festered until it looked nearly as bad as my knee, and our blister wouldn't heal. We'd lost all the first aid in the storm, so the only medicine we had was rest. For days after that, we did nothing but what we absolutely had to do to stay alive. Our morale had never been so low. We'd never felt so utterly wretched and defeated. But it was in that time, after the expeditions, that I first really made friends with Miranda Fallow. While Arnie had been with us, he'd been like a weight in the middle of a balance bar. He'd kept us together, but in a way, he'd also kept us apart. We'd been friends and allies, but Miranda had still been very cool girl to me, someone so distant and admirable. She was not quite human. When we were climbing the North Headland in the south, we had been as down as two people could be, and it had come through only by clinging to each other. There was no distance left between us by the time we got back. There was no fear. I'm gonna back that a little bit. There we go. Maybe you have to be naturally shy to know what I mean by that. We spent most of the time talking when we were sick. We had nothing else to do. Miranda told me about her parents, who were both anthropologists, how she traveled with them in all sorts of wild places when she was a child, but now she was at boarding school, which was okay, but lonely. I told her about my great-grandmother's farm in Jamaica, which is the place I love most on earth, and my aunts, really my great-aunts, who never got married and don't like children underfoot, which means that when we go there on holiday, my brother and I run absolutely wild. I told her about being shy. She told me about having parents who are so high-powered and so interested in each other that you can't possibly compete. We talked about ambition. We both wanted to be scientists, friends and enemies, TV and music. We talked about sex and romance and life and death. We never talked about being stranded there permanently. We had to keep hoping. Little bad things happened. The ants got into my patent ant-free food storage. Little good things happened. We found more wild banana trees. I speared my first fish. Neither of us got our period, which was a blessing. I think it was because we weren't eating enough. I wasn't chubby anymore, and Miranda was like a sunburned skeleton. We kept on cutting the notches as best as we could, with Miranda's pocket knife. In a way, I wished we could stop. I didn't want to think about how much time had passed, how little hope there was left of rescue. But it would have been hard to give up the ritual. Sometimes I'd look at her and I'd think, You? It seems very weird to meet someone, another girl, on a plane, and it turns out she might be your life's only companion forever. On day 40, we were feeling better. Our feet had healed up, and we'd had good luck with our fishing, so we'd eaten well the night before. We'd been taking it in turns to hobble up and get water, but we hadn't had a swim in the waterfall pool since before the expeditions. We decided that today we were strong enough. So we set out, wearing coconut clogs tied to our feet with rags, and taking with us our water canteen and some fish coconut wild banana lunch. Me in my cut-off denims and the white Planet Savers jacket that had belonged to Sophie Merritt. Miranda in her tough old combat shorts and her black t-shirt. These were our best clothes. Since Arnie had gone, we hadn't worn anything much at all on the beach. I think we dressed up to celebrate feeling stronger again. We weren't exactly expecting to meet anyone. We reached the pool, stripped off, had a swim, and got dressed again. For something to do, Miranda started looking for ways to begin the climb that we'd long ago decided was impossible. My brother just walked out the door, sorry. I wandered around, poking at the leaf litter, thinking I might try digging for edible roots. Miranda pulled herself up under the falling water, into the cleft in the rock that was as high as we'd ever been able to reach. "Hey, Sammy," she called in a very strange, questioning sort of voice. "Come here?" I went over, and she helped me haul myself up. She pointed. "Do you see what I see, or am I imagining it?" We could both see a strand of bright orange fishing twine, caught on a projection in the rock wall, deep inside the cleft. I looked at her and nodded. "I can see it." "My God, you see what that means? Arnie was here. Arnie was in there." "I don't believe it," I whispered. Miranda groped in the pocket of her shorts, brought out a small shell, and tossed it into the dark. It vanished with a rattling sound. "I'm going to try and get farther in." "Be careful," I begged. "Please be careful." She squeezed herself upward and inward. "It gets wider. Oh, I'm through." I followed her. We were in a narrow, wet, black passage. The few first meters must have been a tight fit for Arnie, but then it got a little wider. The air was fresh. We could hardly see a thing. We groped along, me very scared that we'd get stuck. And then, when I was going to suggest turning back, there was a light ahead. A little more groping, and we were in a tall, narrow cave, looking out over a hidden valley. We decided long ago that our island, if it was an island, must be volcanic, and the cliff at the back of our bay was probably the side of an extinct volcano cone. This valley must be inside the crater. That was astonishing enough, but there were buildings below us. Modern, concrete buildings, not grass huts. "Wow," breathed Miranda. "Civilization." She kept on staring, mesmerized, telling me the details that I couldn't make out. Roads, fields, a big fence, a helicopter pad, something that looked like a football stadium with floodlights. I looked around the entrance of the cave, hoping for more signs of Arnie. Something glinted, peeping out from a mass of creepers. I jumped because I was afraid it was a snake. But it wasn't. I got hold of it, hardly able to believe my eyes. It was the machete. "Miranda," I gasped. I stood there, holding Arnie's machete. My heart was beating like a drum. Arnie had come through here nearly 30 days ago, dropped his machete, gone down to those buildings. But why hadn't he come back for us? What had happened to him? "Hey, Miranda!" She'd gone. For a moment I'd thought she'd vanished, like Arnie. Then I heard her calling, "Sammy, come down here, I found a road!" I followed her through the lush undergrowth, clutching Arnie's machete, and soon we were both standing on a graded, stony jeep track, with our mouths open and eyes popping in amazement. "We're saved! We're saved!" yelled Miranda. We grabbed each other, jumping up and down and shrieking. Then we heard the rumbling of an engine. A big jeep was coming up the track. It stopped. About a dozen men in pale-colored uniforms jumped out. I stared at them, stunned. Miranda yelled, "Hurrah!" or something. The men were big and brown-skinned. They had round, curly heads. Their faces were blurred blanks to me. They talked to each other in a language I didn't understand, and I began to feel that something might be wrong. They didn't sound friendly. It flashed into my mind that maybe they were soldiers. Maybe we'd stumbled upon something secret, like a military radar station. But surely they couldn't blame us. We couldn't help being castaways. "Samira, run!" yelled Miranda. The men had grabbed her. They shouted at me and pointed at the machete. "Oh, this?" I said. "Oh, it doesn't mean anything. It's not mine." I threw it aside. Two of the men jumped at me, and I started to struggle. One of them hit me on the arm. It felt like a punch, but it must have been an injection of some kind. Suddenly, I was looking up the sky. My bad knee hurt where it was twisted under me, and then everything went black. Chapter 5. I woke up in a bed. It felt very strange, after sleeping on palm fronds on the sand for so long. I wasn't comfortable. I felt lost and uneasy, as if I wasn't attached to the earth anymore. I lay looking at the tight white sheets, trying to remember how I'd got here. I was still dressed, and that puzzled me, because I seemed to be in some kind of hospital. I turned over and saw that Miranda was beside me in another bed. The room we were in was long and bright, with white painted walls. Tropical sunlight streamed in through the windows. Though we were lying next to each other, she was out of reach. There were bars between us, floor to ceiling. There were 2 rows of 5 beds, exactly like a hospital ward. The other beds were empty. Each one of them was caged in bars. Miranda turned over and looked at me. "What's going on?" I whispered. "I don't know. I didn't last much longer than you did. I tried being quiet and obedient, but they knocked me out anyway. You should have run for it when you had the chance, Semi." "Oh, sure," I said. "Either they'd have caught me, or I'd have spent the rest of my short, lonely life back on the beach, eating sand and playing with sharks. No thanks." We laughed and sat up. We were both still wearing our ragged best clothes, still dirty and sweaty and salt-crusted. No one had brought us any food or water. There was nothing in our cages besides the beds, no bedside cabinets, not even a light switch. "How did we get there? Did you see anything on the way?" "No," said Miranda. "I was knocked out by the cave, the same as you. Those men grabbed me. They grabbed you. They put us in a jeep, and I woke up here just now. I don't remember anything else." She got out of bed and looked at the bars. The door to her cage was locked, not with a padlock, but with a swipe card box that had a keypad of buttons. "Well, we're still prisoners, but I don't think we're in paradise anymore." "That's an improvement anyway," I said, as bravely as I could. I was sick of paradise. I got out of bed, too. My door was locked, the same way. We stood looking at each other, 2 dirty, sunburned skeletons, with bars between us. "Maybe it is a prison," said Miranda. "An Ecuadorian high-security prison, on a lonely island with no other inhabitants." "That would make sense. This could be the prison hospital. I suppose they put us in here because they didn't know what else to do with us." "But they'll let us go. Surely they'll let us go." "Of course they will. Don't be daft. Can you speak Spanish?" "No, I can speak a bit of French, and I can speak Jamaican. I mean, Jamaican English, if that would help. That's all." "I only speak French and a bit of German. I think they're speaking Spanish. But someone will understand English, won't they?" I pleaded. "Bound to. People speak English everywhere. We'll be on our way home soon." We were both frightened. There was something weird about all this, but Miranda was much better at keeping it down than I was. We heard footsteps approaching the door of the ward. We jumped back into bed and lay there. It seemed the wise thing to do. The man who came to the room looked like a doctor. He was wearing a white coat and carrying a clipboard of notes. He had white skin, the kind that never turns color in the sun, but just keeps going on red and peeling. He had wire-rimmed glasses and yellowish hair that was going thin on top. "Good," he said, standing outside our cages. "You're awake." It should have been a big relief to hear him speak English, but it wasn't. Maybe it was the way he looked at us, though I couldn't see his expression clearly. Maybe it was the tone of his voice. He sounded as if he was talking to 2 half-starved, ragged teenage girls who had turned up somewhere they shouldn't be. He sounded extremely different from that. He sounded cold, angry, and also, which was very weird, afraid. When you can't see people's expressions too well, you pay a lot of attention to their voices. "Where are we?" said Miranda. "What is this place? Is it a prison?" He gave a short laugh. "No. The island is private property. You were caught trespassing. But we couldn't help it. We were shipwrecked. Plane wrecked. Look, we're sorry we were trespassing, but we've been stranded for over a month. We have to get in touch." "No need to worry about that at the moment. Come along." "We're very hungry," said Miranda, "and thirsty. And can we please use the bathroom?" He unlocked our cages. "This way," he said, shepherding us ahead of him out the door. "We want to give you a medical check." There were 2 of the big brown-skinned men in uniform in the corridor. We went along with them willingly. We didn't want to be knocked out again. Miranda kept on asking questions, but neither of the men in uniform nor the doctor took any notice. We were taken into a room, like a doctor's surgery. The men in uniform stayed outside. We were allowed to use the bathroom then. We went in together. Neither of us felt like staying outside alone with the strange doctor. It was an ordinary small bathroom with a toilet and basin and a shower and a mirror. I felt like a visitor from the Stone Age, sitting up on the gleaming white porcelain throne, and I was so nervous I couldn't make myself pee. We stared at ourselves in the mirror over the basin. "What a sight," muttered Miranda. "Look at our nails. Look at our hair. We look like very thin Flintstones. We look like mad fakers in India. If there'd been a window, I think we might have tried to wriggle through it. But that would have been stupid. We'd better go out," I said, "before they come in after us." "We're on our way home," said Miranda firmly. "Soon, for certain." We squeezed hands and returned to face our mysterious, scary rescuers. Another of the big men had come into the surgery, this one dressed in a white coat like the doctor. He seemed to be a nurse. My feelings kept going up and down, bouncing like a yo-yo. When the doctor said medical check, I thought everything was going to be all right. That sounded like a normal thing to do with two castaways. But when the medical check was happening, it didn't feel right. We were weighed, and our eyes looked at, and our throats looked at. Our reflexes checked. Our body fat, such as it was measured with calipers. The doctor man looked at my knee and our feet. The nurse man took blood samples, at which point I had to sit down very quickly. I suppose I was so pared down that I didn't have a milliliter of blood to spare. Then came the really strange part. We had to do a sort of IQ test on a printed sheet. "What's this?" said Miranda. "What on earth's going on?" "Please do as you're told. Look, we're not applying for jobs here. We were shipwrecked. Our plane crashed. We want to go home. You'll understand why we need this information later. Please fill in the questionnaire." So we answered the questions, which are general knowledge and things like, do you sleep well? Do you make friends easily? Do you think you react well in emergencies? "Maybe it's to see if being plane wrecked made us go crazy," whispered Miranda. We had to swallow hysterical giggles. The doctor and his assistant were wearing plastic gloves, so they didn't actually touch us. They never looked us in the eye except when they had to, and hardly spoke to us. There'd have been more contact between a vet and a couple of sick rabbits, and they were afraid. I knew that, with every instinct. This gave me an extremely creepy feeling. "You're both in remarkably good shape," said the doctor at last, "considering that you've been living on the beach, entirely on your own resources, for well over a month. You're in very good shape indeed. A recalcitrant infection in that left knee, but it's not going to be a problem." "You knew we were there?" said Miranda. We stared at him, completely astonished. "Oh, yes," said the doctor, shrugging. "Of course we did." So then we knew. It was like waking up in the dark on the flight to Quito, seeing that fastened seatbelt signs, and hearing the shouting in the cockpit. "This is it. We're in trouble." But what kind of trouble could we possibly be in? Miranda kept on staring at him. "What's your name?" she asked. "Skinner," he said, biting his lip. "You can call me Dr. Skinner. Wait here." He went away. The big nurse, who was wearing one of those pale uniforms under his white coat, stood watching us with folded arms. We didn't like to speak to each other. I had the same weird tingling in my throat and stomach that I remembered from the night of the plane crash. After a short while, Dr. Skinner came back. "Dr. Franklin will see you now." "Who's Dr. Franklin?" asked Miranda. "The owner of the island. My boss. Come along." "Someone owns this whole island? As I told you, this is private property. He must be very rich. Is he famous? Is he English like you?" He laughed again, short and contemptuous. "So many questions," was his only answer. Our guards, they seemed like guards, followed us to the end of the corridor, where some automatic doors opened, and we were outdoors in a big courtyard. The first thing I noticed was that it smelled like a zoo. Then I realized it was a zoo. There were long rows of cages and several houses for bigger animals, with a sleeping block in the back and a fenced run-out at the front. In the distance, I could see a paddock with blurred brown shapes in it, horses or maybe deer. The courtyard was well cared for. The pavement was clean. There were trees and flowering plants, but the smell of captive animals was very strong. I saw a couple of the pale uniformed men moving around. They seemed to be tending the greenery. They took no notice of us. All these cages made me think of the bars in the prison ward. Dr. Skinner didn't hurry us. He let us look. The first place we passed was a small corral where a few animals, like little fat deer, with blunt muzzles and coarse gingery fur, were standing around doing nothing. "Capybara," said Dr. Skinner. "Native of Argentina, related to the guinea pig. Very stupid." One of the capybaras were sitting alone, next to the fence, in a strangely human posture. As we approached, it got to its feet and turned to look at us. It had the same blunt muzzle as the others, but its lips were puffy and red, which looked very odd. It made miserable slobbery sound and shuffled off toward the sleeping house, moving slowly and awkwardly. Miranda caught her breath. Its back legs, though they were covered in ginger fur, looked as if they'd been put on the wrong way around. They were dumpy, dwarfish human legs with human feet. We stared at Dr. Skinner. He smiled unpleasantly and moved on. The next enclosure smelled of pigs. There was a huge, dark-colored, bristly sow in there, laying on her side. She looked normal. Her stripy piglets, who were scrabbling around fighting to get her to teats, were like the piglets I had seen in the wood. They had human hands. The way they squealed and chattered at each other in high-pitched, almost childish voices made me feel sick. "Take your time," said Dr. Skinner. "Why not? Take a good look at all our curiosities. You may learn something." There was a dark, covered passageway, night-lit, where a colony of things like bats stared at us from behind glass. They had leathery wings and pointed animal faces, but they were hanging the wrong way up, for bats. Their naked, pale little human legs dangled down, kicking aimlessly at the air. There was an aquarium, where something that looked like a monkey head with an octopus tentacles crawled around and round its tank, looking very bored and completely terrified, if that combination is possible. In another tank of a group of lobsters, I couldn't see what had been done to them, sat gazing at us, like the live lobsters you sometimes see in a seafood restaurant. There was an aviary of bright-colored parrots, some of them normal, some of them with floppy miniature human hands or feet, or patches of human skin sticking out between their breast feathers. The poor birds were tearing at these growths with their beaks. The floppy hands and feet reminded me of the shark-chewed limbs of the girl who waved. Next to the aviary, in a run with some bare branches propped together as a sort of climbing frame, there was a spotted jungle cat, all alone. It wasn't weird to look at, not in any way that we could see, but it crouched in a corner of its cage, its front paws over its cat face, moaning softly. "Is that what you do?" said Miranda finally. "You collect freaks? But what for?" "We don't collect them," said Dr. Skinner with a tight-lipped smile. "We create them." "You create them? How?" "Gene grafting. Surely you've heard of genetic engineering." "But what are you trying to do?" I demanded. "What's the point in it? Are you trying to turn animals into humans? That's just cruel." "Animals into humans? No!" Dr. Skinner laughed with contempt again, as if he couldn't believe my stupidity. But in his voice I heard fear, horror and fear. The animal experiments are steps on the way to a much greater goal. They were all essential to the project. We don't cause needless suffering. But we've gone beyond them now. Have you seen enough? We nodded, very uneasily. He took us indoors again, through another door, out of the heat and into the air-conditioned coolness. It was a relief to get away from the zoo smell, but I was beginning to think I must be asleep and having a bad dream. Dr. Skinner tapped on a door and a voice called, "Come in." The room was like another doctor's surgery, only grander. A man, another white man, got up from behind a big desk and came out to greet us. He looked about 50 or 60-ish. He was tall, he had broad shoulders and rather long, thick, gray, wavy hair, almost to his shoulders. It framed a broad, tanned face with a big nose and a wide, thin mouth. His eyes were very bright. I noticed them when he came close to shake my hand. Later on, it was always his eyes that I remembered. Later on, just thinking about those bright, cold eyes would make me shake with terror. "Ah, Miranda, Semi. It's very pleased to meet you at last." He shook our hands. He had a rich, smooth, calm voice and an American accent. "Do sit down. We have a lot to talk about." "First things first," said Miranda briskly. "Apparently you and Dr. Skinner know that we've been stranded on your island for ages, so you must realize we need to get in touch with our families. We need to contact the authorities, the British Embassy, tell them we're okay, and get ourselves back to Quito. Or wherever's nearest. Is Quito the nearest city? We don't know where we are. We don't want to put you in any trouble, but we need your help. We want to go home." Dr. Franklin chuckled and smiled broadly as if she'd made another good joke. He sat down again behind his desk. "I don't think we'll be contacting the authorities just yet. Do sit down." So we sat down. When I first saw Dr. Franklin, I was relieved. I didn't like his eyes, but he seemed like a normal person, not spooky and mad like Skinner and the guards. I thought, thank goodness, at last we've reached someone in charge, now we'll be okay. But the moment I saw that smile, the relief began to drain out of me. I didn't have a clue what was going on, but I knew there was something very, very wrong with this man, with everything. "In good health," he said, leaning forward, steepling his hands and beaming at us over his fingertips. "Highly resourceful, psychologically very resilient. Good, excellent." "Resilient?" I repeated. It wasn't that I didn't understand the word. It was because I couldn't understand why these compliments sounded so creepy. It means you bounce back, young ladies. You don't crawl into a corner whimpering when you're faced with a tremendous challenge. You deal with it. Now, Dr. Skinner tells me you've been asking a lot of questions. Naturally, you want to know what we are doing here. Let me see. I'd better start by finding out what you know. We don't, I began. I was going to tell him we weren't interested in what was going on, and we didn't want to know about his nasty experiments. We wanted to leave. At once. But Miranda kicked me and shook her head a little, so I stayed quiet. I remembered what she'd said to me and Arnie on the beach long ago. Any information might be useful. There was a glowing white screen on the wall behind his desk. He tapped some keys on a keyboard in front of him, and an image appeared there. I couldn't make it out much. Can either of you tell me what this is? I think it's a photograph of some human chromosomes, said Miranda. Ah, good, very good, excellent. Do you know what chromosomes are, Semi? What DNA comes in, I said. The sort of packets the DNA comes in the nucleus of a cell. Good. Now then, do either of you know what transgenic means? It's genetic engineering, I said. If you insert different genes or parts of genes into chromosomes in a cell, you can get the cell to accept them and make them work. Then the plant or animal... If you insert different genes or parts of genes into the chromosomes in a cell, and you can get the cell to accept them and make them work, then the plant or animal or whatever will develop differently. It will be a transgenic organism. Like, you can make crops that are resistant to weed killer, so you can spray the whole field and only the weeds will die. We've done a bit of that in school. Good, very good, said Dr. Franklin again, with his creepy, beaming smile. But as you have seen on the little tour Dr. Skinner gave you, our work is of a different order. We are tackling a much greater challenge, much more exciting than tinkering around with vegetables. We are... He stopped and smirked. Well, not to let false modesty get in the way, let's say I, with the assistance of Dr. Skinner, am on the brink of producing transgenic human beings. Think about it. See if you can picture some of the possibilities. Imagine being as strong as an elephant. Imagine being able to use sunshine to make food like a plant. Imagine being able to fly like a bird. Imagine being able to breathe underwater and swim with the fishes. Imagine, though this is farther off, I admit, being able to breathe different gases or live comfortably in the hard vacuum of space. He paused and stared at us expectantly. I nodded, and I saw Miranda was doing the same. I wonder if she was feeling as bewildered as I was. I had that tingling feeling in my throat and stomach, stronger than ever. I looked behind me. I hadn't realized it before, but Dr. Skinner was still there, at another smaller desk, making notes on a laptop computer. It was like being on a mad, horrible school trip. We'd had the tour, now we were getting the talk from the person in charge. Dr. Franklin started to tell us about his first human trials, which he said were about to begin. He was planning to build a human bird and a human fish. He said there were very good technical reasons why certain kind of animals were among the first he would attempt, but happily, they were also the forms with the most exciting advantages for the future of the race. Miranda and I managed to exchange glances while he was pointing at his screen. We didn't need to speak. The message, "He's mad," passed between us loud and clear. We both turned to look at Dr. Skinner. He knew we were looking at him. I saw his forehead and his ears turning redder than ever. But he kept his head down and kept tapping away at the keys. It was obvious we would get no help here. So, which of you would like to be? Which would you like best to be, Semi? Miranda, a bird, or a fish? In my case, I think flight would be a great attraction, if I had your young cells. But alas, it's too late. Would you like to make your choice now, or should I tell you more? Said Dr. Franklin. There's a school bus. We wanted to get out of there, but that wasn't on the menu. Please, tell us more, said Miranda faintly. So Dr. Franklin told us more. He told us that the idea of growing a new kind of human being from scratch was a non-starter, and everyone who was trying that kind of research was a benighted fool. His chances of success were much greater with his special secret method that nobody else had tried, of putting new genes into a ready-made living human body and getting it to change. He proved that with his animal experiments. He told us how he could inject artificial chromosomes into the bone marrow, and then normal cells in the body would rapidly replace with cells with different DNA that would take over and change the whole organism, like cuckoos in the nest, he said, and laughed loudly at his own joke. He told us how a human skeleton would become a fish skeleton, with the bones turning into cartilage, or, in the case of a bird transgenic, the bird person's bones would become hollow and gristle, that means fragile and slight. How the bird person's blood would be altered so it could process more oxygen, because flight takes a huge amount of energy. Oxygen is the fuel the body burns to power its muscles, and a bird has much bigger muscles relative to body weight than a human. How the fish person's limbs would fall off or fuse together, and gills would grow in the person's neck. How the lungs would be changed, and the liver and the skin. Images, blurred and meaningless to me, kept flashing up on the wall screen. Sometimes he'd swing around on his chair and point at them with a laser light pen. I kept thinking that we ought to ask questions. Maybe we could get on the right side of this madman by pretending to be keen about his insane ideas. But Miranda had gone very quiet, and I couldn't make myself speak. My throat had closed up, and my ears were ringing. I felt as if someone had given me a huge smack across the head. Dizzy, dazed, sort of otherworldly, as if I was going to faint. It had to be a joke. Surely this must be a joke. He couldn't really be planning to do that kind of unbelievable things he was describing to real people. Either it was a joke, or I was dreaming. I felt like crying, or bursting into hysterical laughter. Every so often he'd stop and wait, staring at us with those bright eyes, and we'd nod at him madly. That was all he seemed to expect. At last he stopped, and didn't start up again. The screen went gray. It was over. "Any questions?" Miranda said stubbornly. "When can we call our parents?" Dr. Franklin looked pleased. He chuckled and shook his head. "Full marks for persistence, Miranda, and keeping your own interest in mind. Well done. You may go now. My assistant will give you each an information pack. Study the literature carefully. Dr. Skinner, you can take them back to the ward." He came out from behind the desk and shook our hands again. "I'm very pleased to have such excellent candidates for my first human trials. Fortune smiles on me. Well, fortune always favors the brave, they say. Now you should get some rest. You have a big day tomorrow. And remember, you're totally free to make that choice." Dr. Skinner walked us back through the zoo again. He stopped by the capybara enclosure and stared at the one with human legs and human lips. "Where'd you get the human genes from?" said Miranda, her voice expressionless. He looked at her with a sneer. "Where do you think? From humans. Originally some of the DNA was mine, and some of it was his. Rebuilt, of course. Lately we've been using DNA cultured from tissue samples taken from our employees' children. Young cells are essential for the kind of work we're doing now. The kids don't know what we're doing. They don't suffer any harm. A scraping from the inside of your cheek or a small blood sample never hurt anyone." Miranda nodded. "But why the lips?" she whispered, as if she didn't want the poor capybara to hear. "Why the back legs? It seems so pointless. What's the advantage?" "It doesn't work like that, Miranda. Transgenics can be rather random. Sometimes we don't know, until we see the results, what part of the animal is going to change." "What happens if you change something so it doesn't work anymore?" I quavered. "We've had plenty of losses, and some survive in very twisted forms. But our goal is to take humanity beyond all the limits. Of course there's a price to pay." He walked us on. "Where do you get the animals?" said Miranda. "Are they wildlife from the island?" "Some," he said. "The pigs, the parrots, the bats, the snakes. Others we buy." "You mean you have a supplier who makes deliveries by air or by sea?" Dr. Skinner smiled, thin smile again. "You never give up, do you, Miranda?" "Do all the people in uniform live on the island?" "Oh, yes," he said, "with their families and all the amenities. Dr. Franklin treats his employees well. They're very loyal to him. They wouldn't help anyone who wanted to leave without his permission. That's definitely not worth considering," and he laughed. When we got back to the ward, the guards stayed outside. Dr. Skinner handed each of us one of the plastic folders that he'd been carrying since we left Dr. Franklin, showed us into our cages, and locked the door. Then he stood looking at us with horror and pity, exactly the way we'd stared at the weird animals in Dr. Franklin's zoo. We stared back at him. "This is crazy," said Miranda at last. "You can't keep us here. Dr. Skinner, what your boss is doing to those animals is horrible, but it's none of our business. We're not going to tell anyone. You have to let us go." "We've got family. We've got friends," I babbled. "You can't keep us prisoners." "Oh, yes, we can, Semi. Think about it. Try to put two and two together. Your charter plane crashed 45 days ago. Of course, and sometime after spending sending an emergency message that appeared to indicate a massive mid-air explosion. We've been in contact with the search and rescue operation. They found no survivors, no wreckage, and when their search widened to include this area, we were able to tell them nothing. No one's looking for you anymore. We've been waiting until we were sure of that, and if you hadn't found your way to us, we'd have been coming to pick you up soon. Have you ever been afraid you were lost? When you were little, at a fairground or in a crowded shopping center maybe? Maybe you remember how at first you didn't realize what was wrong. You were sure the next person you ran up to would be your mother. The next big man shape you saw would be Daddy. But the strange faces look down on you, not Daddy, not Mummy. And you run away from them. You start running faster, as if by running you can catch up with the normal world that was all around you a few minutes ago, and be safe. In the end, you're running through the crowd of big people, tears pouring down your face, frightened to death. We didn't know how we were going to tackle the human trials, he said, watching our faces. But you are ideal. You are missing, believed dead. You don't exist. But things are even worse than you imagine. Not just lost forever, but cold tremors went through me. The monstrous truth was dawning on me, and I knew why Dr. Skinner had looked so afraid, so horrified, right from the first moment. He's not really going to be experiment on us, I gasped in utter disbelief. Not really? I'm afraid he is. What if we say no, said Miranda at last. Will he kill us? Kill you? Certainly not. What use would that be? Dr. Franklin is going to change you, the way the animals you've seen were changed. You are the next stage. You won't say no. You won't be asked for your consent. Didn't you hear me? You don't exist. You can't let this happen, said Miranda. We're innocent human beings. He laughed bitterly. Is there such thing as an innocent human being? I don't think so. He ran his hands through his thin hair and wiped the sweat that had gathered on his forehead, although it was cool in there. I've tried to put it off, he muttered, staring at us as if he hated us, but it was bound to come to this. We've gone as far as we can, infusing human genetic material into dumb animals. Don't you see? We can't exactly advertise for teenage volunteers for this, can we? But we have to have human trials. It's the only next step. Then experiment on yourselves, snapped Miranda. I said teenage. Haven't you been listening to a word you've been told? We are too old, Dr. Franklin and I. This is the way it has to be. And you can forget about appealing to my better nature. I have none. He came closer to the bars, his voice rising hysterically. He's a genius. He's crazy, but he is a genius. You'll serve the cause of human progress. You will become more than human. Look on it as a great adventure. I don't believe this, said Miranda. It's not going to happen. You're not going to let it happen. You'll keep us for a few days. You'll talk Dr. Franklin out of his crazy idea, and you'll see that he lets us go. Now can we have something to eat? He shook his head. No, nothing to eat. An orderly will bring you some water. You'll be having your pre-med early tomorrow morning. The initial bone marrow extraction will be done under general anesthetic. He started to walk away, then he turned back. Oh, by the way, don't try pleading with our orderlies. They don't understand much English, and even if they did, they accept completely Dr. Franklin's rights to deal with trespassers. I told you, Miranda, they are all very loyal. All of them. They know our work here is very secret, very sensitive. I think they have an idea that we are connected with the U.S. government. It isn't true, but it's a useful story. They will not help you. One of the men in uniform came, with a carafe of water and 2 paper cups. He waited while we drank, and took the cups and the carafe away. He didn't speak to us. We didn't speak until he was gone. I looked at the bars in my cage, how thick they were. I wondered why Dr. Franklin had made them so thick. Why did the beds have to be in cages at all? What did he think would happen when we started turning human beings into something more than human? At last, Miranda said softly, looking at the floor of her cage. When Dr. Skinner came to fetch us, he knew we were awake. Let's see if we can spot the cameras. We paced up and down, saying things that didn't matter. I said, he thinks we were 45 days on the beach. I wonder when our counting went wrong. Maybe it didn't. Maybe we're right, and he's trying to confuse us. I wonder if it's still day 40. Maybe it's day 41. I'm hungry enough. We don't know how long we were knocked out for. I think it's still day 40, she glanced at me, and I nodded slightly. She'd found the camera lens peering down at us from the slot high up in the wall. We took the 2 information packets and sat on the floor up against the bars that separated us, with our backs as if accidentally turned to the spying eye, and kept our voices low. There wasn't much point in this. The true horror was that our captors didn't care what we plotted against their schemes. No more than if we'd been two guinea pigs planning a breakout, but it made us feel a little bit better. I turned the pages, occasionally muttering something to Miranda, but I couldn't take in anything. I dropped my spinning head in my hands. "Oh, Miranda, this can't be real," I whispered. "Can it be? Is this real?" "I hope not," she said grimly. "I hope it's a nightmare, and we'll wake up safe on the beach, alone with those nice friendly sharks in the lagoon. But if it's a nightmare, it's very realistic, because he is real. Dr. George Franklin, I've heard of him." "What do you mean you've heard of him?" "From my parents. You remember what I told you about them? They're anthropologists." "That means they study people, doesn't it? What's that got to do with genetic engineering?" "Nothing much. But a few years ago, Dr. George Franklin was famous in science. He had all kinds of ideas about how humans might be changed in the future by genetic engineering. The same sort of thing as he was saying to us. Imagine if people could fly, imagine if people could live under the ocean. People listened to him, even though the things he was suggesting were completely impossible back then. And they still are, as far as I know, but he's very rich. He inherited a huge fortune, so he didn't need anyone's approval. He ran his own projects and paid his own scientists to work on his weird ideas. I think he was even a futurology consultant or something to the U.S. government for a while. Then he got prosecuted for doing some cruel experiments on chimpanzees. That was the end of his public career. My parents and their friends used to use his name as an example of a mad scientist. Science gone bad. That's why I remembered." "Is that why you went all quiet back in his office?" "Yes. He's crazy, isn't he?" She nodded. "Yeah, I think you could safely say that. And Skinner's mad, too. The way he looks at us, the things he says. Yes, they're definitely both insane. But they can't experiment on us. They just can't. They just can't." "I think we have to work on Dr. Skinner," said Miranda. "I think what happened over the chimpanzees was that one of Dr. Franklin... I think what happened over the chimpanzees was that one of Dr. Franklin's assistants had an attack of guilty conscience and blew the whistle on him. We have to get Skinner to do that." "I don't think so, Miranda. I think he used to have a conscience, but he strangled it." "He cares about the animals," said Miranda. "I know he hates us because we make him feel so guilty. But I was watching his face when we were walking around the zoo. He's sorry for them, and he's afraid." "Yes, I noticed that. Well, of course he's afraid. His boss is going to make him murder two teenagers, basically." I swallowed hard. I still couldn't possibly believe those two teenagers were us. I wonder what Dr. Franklin has got on him to keep him here. Maybe he's been in trouble with the law. Maybe he's been thrown out of respectable science, too. This is the only job he could get. But he must be lonely. He must be starved for friendship. We'll have to try and get him to talk, make personal contact. It's what you're supposed to do if you get kidnapped or if you get trapped by an evil psychopath. You're supposed to talk to the attacker, humor him, befriend him, make him realize that you're human so he can't do what he planned. That's the kind of strange thing, like How to Be a Castaway, that you learn from films, from newspapers, documentaries, from the TV news. But never in a million years do you think it will happen to you. A faint hope rose in me. Maybe it could be done. Miranda had saved me so often. Maybe she could even save us now. I thought about those animals, the capybara with the human lips, the parrots plucking at the growths on their breasts, the bats with tiny, dangling human legs. Suddenly, I remembered something. "Miranda, I saw one. I saw one of those piglets with hands. What do you mean?" We both thought, "No." "Ages ago, before Arnie disappeared, the day we went foraging. I told her what I'd seen in the northern woods, by the pool in the dark clearing. Why didn't you tell me about it?" "Because I thought I was seeing things, and then Arnie..." My eyes filled with tears. Miranda was being tough and calm as ever, but I was losing my grip. "The truth is, I didn't want you to know," I wailed. "I didn't want you to know I was having hallucinations. I was always the weak link, wasn't I? You and Arnie, you were both okay. He was big and strong, and you can do anything. But I was useless. I knew I was. Remember the snake in the shelter? I nearly got you killed that time." I was breaking down, beginning to sob. I couldn't help myself. "Oh, come on. The snake probably wasn't even poisonous. I'm stupid about snakes is all." She slipped her arms through the bars, took my hand and squeezed it. "You were not useless. Who invented the shadow clock?" "I didn't think of that myself. I remembered it out of a book." "You remembered lots of brilliant things. What about the ant-proof food storage?" "The ants got into it, yeah, but only at the very end. And you invented the firebox." "I didn't. I just thought of making one. You made it. If I told you about that piglet, we'd have known something weird was going on. We'd have a warning. Miranda shook her head. Nah, I'd never believed you. How could anyone believe something like that? What could we have done anyways? We were trapped. They'd have come to fetch us in the end if we hadn't found the passage. Silence fell. It seemed as if we'd run out of things to say. Hey, said Miranda at last, if your piglet escaped, maybe we can escape too. We'll have to hurry, I said. We're going to be operated on in the morning. The room had grown dim. Outside, the brilliant sunlight was fading into the swift tropical dusk. Soon it would be night. I wished I knew if it was day 40 or day 41. That seemed to matter a lot. If this was my last day on Earth, I would like to be able to think I'd still been free when it began. A free castaway, a prisoner in paradise, but I had no way of knowing. Operated on in the morning. She kept holding my hand, and I kept holding hers, but each of us was alone, a million miles apart. I saw my information pack lying on the floor. I let go of Miranda's hand, grabbed it, and threw it away from me so it whammed against the bars. As if I cared what kind of a monster I was doomed to become. Yes, that was it. Better face up to the truth. There was no escape. Either we were going to be tortured to death, or we were going to be turned into monsters. Depending on whether Dr. Franklin was a crazy genius or plain crazy, I got up and flung myself onto the bed. Miranda lay down too. We didn't cry. We didn't talk anymore. We just lay there. Alright, I'll read chapter 6. Let's do it. Someone was shining a bright light into my eyes. My brain dissolved into a puddle of terror. I thought this was it. Dr. Franklin had come to take me. Then Dr. Skinner turned the penlight beam on the other way, shining it on his own face. Come on, he snapped in an angry undertone. Get up, let's go. When he'd hustled me out of bed, he grabbed my pillow and shoved it down under the sheet. It was dark in the ward, but I could see that Miranda was out of bed too. When she saw what he was doing, she did the same thing with her pillow. He let me out, and then her, and shut the cage doors behind us. The three of us slipped out into the corridor, and he locked the door of the ward too. We walked along to a recessed panel in the wall, which he opened. He pressed a couple of buttons. I thought, he's turning the security system back on, and it was only then that my brain caught up, and my heart leaped. He was helping us to escape. We're going to escape! Come on, he whispered. Don't mess around. Keep up. Miranda and I were barefoot. Dr. Skinner seemed to be used to walking silently. We followed him swiftly along dark corridors, then through some automatic double doors into the big dark hall. There were some long tables, chairs. Light gleamed faintly on glass-fronted counters. It seemed to be a canteen or a cafeteria. He pointed to us to sit down at one of the tables, whispered, Not a word from either of you, and went off. We stared at each other, two shadowy faces, the dark making my eyesight as good as Miranda's. Our hearts were beating hard in hope and fear. Dr. Skinner came back, with his arms full. Not a word, he repeated. Listen. He still sounded as if he hated us. I'm going to let you out of the compound. You're going to make your way to the east shore. There's a motor launch. There'll be no one in it. It will be moored against a jetty. You get into that launch and hide yourselves below in the cabin. You'll be taken to the coast, the mainland. Then you'll be on your own. You'll have to walk. Head north. You'll find a place called the Menozes, where you can find someone who will understand English. Say you were shipwrecked on an empty atoll. There are a few around here. Say you built a raft. Say you floated for days. Say you lost everything, and you have no idea where you were stranded. Say what you like, but I'm saving you. So don't you tell any secrets about what happened to you here. Don't say anything about what he planned to do. Is that agreed? We nodded frantically and tried to whisper our thanks. Don't thank me. I don't even think you'll get away. The people in Menozes will send for Dr. Franklin when 2 castaways turn up. He's a big man around here, the local jefe. You know what that means? They'll send for him. And you'll be back. He set his teeth and grimaced, as if he was in pain. He wants to study the psychological effects. Do you understand me? I'm warning you. He doesn't only want to change you. He wants to play games with you as well. Do you understand me? I don't know why, but I think, in a way, that's what I really can't endure. We stared at him blankly. We didn't have a clue about these games. We were worried about getting killed or changed into monsters. Here, take these, food and water. Come on. He shoved a backpack at each of us. We struggled to put them on and we followed him, walking fast and silently again through the dark hall, through a room with gleams of metal and smells of food that must have been the kitchen, and out into the night. We crossed a pitch-dark yard that smelled of rubbish, bins, and petrol, and came to a door in the wall, where Dr. Skinner stopped and tapped buttons on another keypad. Through the door, and we were in Dr. Franklin's zoo. I could smell the caged animals. I could hear rustlings and faint chittering sounds. As we passed the aviary, a parrot gave a sleepy squawk, and then the jungle cat started crying. Beside me, Dr. Skinner started and drew his breath sharply. "It does that," he muttered. "It does that all the time. We don't know why. We gave the pair of cats an infusion, and that did something to their brains. We don't know what we did, and it can't tell us. Its mate died. It howls. Sometimes it goes on all night and all day. I wish I could kill it, but he'd find out, and he never wants them killed. Never. He always wants to keep his pets alive. It's unbearable. It would drive a sane man mad. Can't hurt me, though. I hate this racket, that's all." He wasn't talking to us. He was talking to himself. We crossed the zoo and left by another door. Then we were outside all the buildings. I could see the stars overhead, each of them giving a glowing halo by my miserable eyesight. I was glad to see them again. Dr. Skinner pressed on. Every few seconds he'd switch on his pen light and flash the white beam around us. Nothing stirred. "Quickly," he muttered. "I have to get you through the perimeter fence, and then I have to get back to the buildings and switch the fence back on. He makes his rounds at night. My boss doesn't need sleep. At midnight he takes a break from work, comes out and walks around the compound, checking every building, every door. It's a habit with him." His pace had speeded up. We were half running to keep close to him. I could feel the dry, stony earth and stalks of rough grass under my hard, bare feet. There's a gate in the fence, and a footpath leading through the mountainside. It's a shortcut to the launch mooring. The kitchen staff use it. When you get to the boat, hide. Don't try to speak to the man who will be taken to the mainland. Don't show yourselves. Our technicians know more than the orderlies about what goes on, but don't push it. He'll help you, but he doesn't want any trouble with the boss. I was thinking about movies I had seen of people escaping from prisoner of war camps. I was praying the floodlights wouldn't come on, praying there'd be no sirens, no voices yelling us to stop. Now we'd reached the fence. There was a small gate set in it. There was an ordinary padlock, no buttons to tap. We waited as he fumbled with the key. He was still muttering under his breath, almost sobbing. "It howls," I heard, and then, "Oh God, it howls. It's only an animal." Miranda and I looked at each other. "I think he's drunk," whispered Miranda. I smelled his breath. Whiskey. "Dr. Skinner," she said aloud, "you'd better come with us. Think about it. He's bound to know you helped us escape. You have to take this chance." I knew she wasn't thinking of Skinner's well-being. He had to come with us. If he stayed behind, hysterical and jabbering like this, he'd be telling Dr. Franklin all about our escape 10 minutes after we'd gone. Now he'd dropped the key. He got down and crawled on his hands and knees, scrabbling for it in the grass. "You'd howl," he was mumbling. "I knew you would. You'd howl too, you girls, and I have no conscience, but I can't stand that noise." He stood up again with the key. The penlight beam reflected in his glasses, giving him 2 mad white pennies for eyes. "But there'll be others," said Miranda quickly. "He'll get a hold of some other teenagers, and they'll howl too. He said it's bound to happen. Come with us. You've been brave so far. You planned everything really well. Now be braver still. Leave him." "I can't leave. You don't know him. He'll know I'll let you go, but he'll forgive me. He needs me. It's not easy to find a scientist of my caliber who is so hard for a job that he would torture children," Miranda finished for him. Dr. Skinner flinched, but he was beyond being insulted. "This is my great work," he whimpered, swaying on his feet. "You don't understand. This is the work. It must go on. Except that you'll howl, you see. I can't stand the idea of lying awake at night, listening." At last he'd managed to unlock the padlock. He held the gate door open. "Go on, go, go!" We couldn't risk arguing with him any longer. Miranda had grabbed my hand, and we were in the act of darting through the gate, leaving Dr. Franklin's hateful compound when the floodlights came on. It wasn't actual floodlights. It was the headlamps of 2 big jeeps parked around about 100 meters away from us. They'd been invisible in the darkness. Dr. Franklin was standing beside the nearer of the two, with a party of the uniformed orderlies. Some of them were holding big flashlights. Some of them had guns in their hands. Dr. Franklin shone his light over our faces, and then fixed the beam on Dr. Skinner. "Well, Charles," he said in that calm, smooth, cheerful voice, "I had a feeling you were going to try something like this. Inevitable, I suppose. Luckily forewarned is forearmed." The light had paralyzed us, but the sound of that voice spurred us into desperate action. We ran together through the open gate, into the mouth of a narrow footpath between high banks. Rods of greenery leaped out of the dark and smacked our faces. The men came pounding after us. We pelted down the hillside, barefoot on sharp stones, looking wildly for some way to leave the path straight into the arms of more Dr. Franklin's men. He was like that, Dr. Franklin. He liked playing games. Maybe he'd wanted to catch Dr. Skinner in the act of helping us, to give him a scare. Maybe he'd forced Skinner to pretend to be helping us so he could test our resilience or soften us up so we'd give them no trouble in the morning. It didn't matter much either way. We'd never had a chance. He'd known exactly what Dr. Skinner would do. He'd known exactly what was going on. We were brought back. Miranda kept pleading with the big men, begging them in English and French to have pity, to think of their own children, to let us go. It had no effect at all. Back into the brilliant mesh of white beams, the jeep headlights and the flashlights. One of the orderlies locked the gates behind us. Dr. Franklin took out a mobile phone, pressed buttons on the keypad, listened for a moment, and said something in Spanish. Then he said to us in English, in a kindly tone, "The power is restored to the fence, young ladies. Remember this. If you try to escape again, it would be irresponsible of me not to protect my experiments, so that fence is electrified. Do not ignore this warning." I felt as if I was standing on a stage, one of my worst nightmares. Two big men held my arms. The other uniformed men were staring at me without pity from behind the lights. Dr. Skinner was huddled up beside Dr. Franklin. He'd taken off his glasses, and he was wiping them carefully, over and over. Dr. Franklin was smiling. He wasn't angry at us for trying to escape. We couldn't make him angry. We were experimental animals. I thought I could hear the jungle cat howling, though we were far away from the zoo. I could see those blurred images on the screen in Dr. Franklin's office. I could see the drawings and the computer images in the information folder. Those were pictures of my body. Those hideous changes would be happening to me. I knew I was helpless in the grip of someone who was truly evil. I had to scream or my chest would burst open. I think Miranda was trying to calm me, but it was as if she wasn't there. I started to fight. I know I bit a man's arm until I tasted warm, salty blood in my mouth. I know he got free. Dr. Franklin had said, "The power is restored." The words flashed on me like a promise, the only possible promise of escape. I ran and leaped for towering wire mesh, praying the voltage would be enough to kill me. But the fence didn't fry me. Dr. Franklin had been lying. I climbed until I lost my grip. As I fell, I heard Dr. Franklin saying coolly, "Well, now we can switch the power back on. That was very interesting. I'll see we have to be careful how we deal with you, Samara." The orderlies carried me back to the prison ward, with me screaming and punching and biting and kicking at them all the way. They knocked me out again. When I came back to consciousness, I was in the prison ward, in bed. I'd been washed. I felt clean, and I knew I wasn't wearing my tattered old castaway clothes. I had bruises all over, same as the morning after the plane crash. I could feel that one of my eyes was closed by a throbbing lump. I tried to sit up. I couldn't. I tried to free my arms from the tight sheets. I couldn't. I finally opened my eyes as best I could and looked down at myself. In the gray light of another dawn, I saw my body wrapped in a whitish linen jacket, with the arms crossed in front and fastened at the back. The material was tough and stiff. It was a straight jacket. Across my chest there was a thick rubbery band pinning me to the bed. There was another band at my waist, another across my legs, and two loops fastening down my ankles. I hate motorcycles. I don't know how to describe the horror of that waking. "Miranda," I whispered. "I'm here, Semi." I turned my head and saw her through the bars, strapped down the same as me. "Oh God, Miranda, I'm sorry." "What for?" "They wouldn't have tied you down. This is my fault. It doesn't matter, Semi. Listen, this is going to happen. We can't stop it." "Oh God, please." "No, don't cry. Listen. The only thing to do is we must accept our fate." I couldn't stand this. I was going to start screaming, and this time I wouldn't stop until I was out of my mind. I would die insane, howling like that jungle cat as they tortured me. But Miranda kept talking. Her voice was a light I could follow, like little glowing lights that led to an emergency exit. "Listen, Semi. This experiment is exciting. Exciting, do you hear? Say it. Exciting," I whispered. I didn't understand, but I was trusting her with my life. "We're going to be made more than human. We're going to have superpowers. I want to go home." "Well, you can't go home. That's over. That's out. So concentrate on the adventure. Skinner's right, you know. Sometimes to move science forward, people have to take tremendous risks. Imagine going up in the air for the first airplane. Imagine being in a space capsule with nothing outside but a hard vacuum. Something goes wrong, and you have to deal with it, however terrified you are, because nobody back home can help. So we're going to imagine we volunteered for this. The straitjackets are to keep our muscles rested before the operation. We volunteered, and now we have to be brave, really, really brave and tough. That sounds good, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound good? I like the idea of being brave. We're going to die. Yes, she said, with a shake in her voice, probably. But we don't have to die screaming. Let's go for quality of life. For believing anything that makes us feel better. Come on, Sammy, try it. Quality of life, I repeated. Volunteers. I remembered that plunge into the cold sea, and Miranda beside me yelling, "Swim the other way!" So, which do you want to be? She whispered. Fish or bird? We're supposed to choose. Do you want the freedom of the ocean or the sky? I'd been afraid of the sea since that horrible night, but I could remember too much about the things that would happen to change someone into a bird. Skeleton changes, growing new muscles, new blood. All I could remember about the fish was the gills in the neck. That didn't sound too bad. I want to be the fish, I said, feeling an awful coward. I'd rather be the fish. I have to be one or the other. Good, said Miranda cheerfully, because I've always wanted to be able to fly. I said, making a huge effort, what kind of bird would you like to be? I think I fancy being a hyacinth macaw. They're the rarest parrots in the world. I'll be worth a lot of money, and I'll be a beautiful color. Turquoise blue, my favorite. Macaws are clever as well. Supposed to be as clever as a 3-year-old child. Yeah, said Miranda, that sounds like me. And we giggled. I don't know how, but she had us giggling. I want to be a shark, I said firmly. A great, big, great white shark. I'll bite Skinner's bum. I'll bite his bum off. Hey, maybe you could be a golden eagle, or what about a condor? Something fierce and big. Maybe I'll be a nightingale. Next to flying, I've always wanted to be able to sing. I can't sing a note as a human being. I think being a fish will be like flying too. I'll be flying in the ocean skies. Maybe I'll be able to talk to dolphins. How long do you think we've got before they come for us? Not long. Let's keep talking. Which ocean would you like to be a fish in? Arctic, Atlantic, Pacific? I read somewhere that the Antarctic Ocean fish have antifreeze for blood, so you won't feel that cold. You'll be able to swim under icebergs. It'll be so beautiful. No thanks. I'll take the Caribbean. I'll seek for pirate treasure. You can adorn yourself with it. You can be a great white shark with diamond earrings. We knew we weren't going to get turned into a real fish and bird. We knew we wouldn't end up looking like natural animals, even if the experiment didn't kill us. But it was better to talk about sharks and nightingales, imagining ourselves as strange monstrosities, human-sized mutant things, and was not going to help. Terrible things happen every day. You read about them in newspapers, you see them reported, you watch the movies. Serial killers murder people, children get tortured. Not all of it is fiction. The bad things have to happen to someone in real life sometimes. As bad luck would have it, it was my turn and Miranda's turn. And why not? Why should we be protected? We lay there talking quietly, and gradually I started to accept the boogeyman had gotten us. We'd fallen out of a space capsule of normal life into the cold, cold dark that surrounds it, where only death is waiting. Nothing could save us, but we didn't have to die screaming. I found out that as long as I didn't move at all, I could keep the panic under control. I could pretend I was lying still because I wanted to lie still. I breathed a few times, practicing. Then I thought of myself inside my body. I imagined a little person, no bigger than a match, walking up inside my chest, as if I lived in my heart. Up through my neck and into my head. There was space in there. My arms were free. There were no rubbery bands pressing me down. My little person had plenty of room. She could sit in an armchair and watch TV. I'm pretending I'm lying still because I want to lie still, I said. That's a good idea, said Miranda. I'll try it. I'm pretending I've walked out of my body and gone to live in my head for the moment. I'm going to sit inside my head, relaxed, watching imaginary TV. Brilliant. Thanks, Sunny. Tell me if you find a good program. Time passed. The morning light got brighter. At last we heard footsteps, and Dr. Skinner came into the room. We watched him coming up to our cages. He looked sick and horrified. I was pleased to see. He needed a shave, too. We lay quiet and watched him. When he came close, Miranda said softly, I'd rather be me. I may be going to die by torture, but I'd rather be me than you. He behaved as if he hadn't heard her speak. One at a time, first me, then Miranda, he injected us with something in our necks, which was the only part of us he could easily reach. When the needle went into me, I knew there was no hope left at all. I nearly lost it. I was whimpering. I whimpered on the edge of screaming. Miranda whispered urgently, Sammy, hey, there's something I forgot. Arnie's here. Dr. Skinner was wheeling a stretcher trolley in from this corridor. Yes, I whispered back. I think you did get here. You found the machete in the cave, and Dr. Franklin knew our names. It went out of my head because there was so much else going on, but of course this is what happened to him. He was caught the same way we were. That's why he vanished. He has to be around somewhere. No, Miranda, Arnie's dead. I've thought about it too. That's why he never came back. They've experimented on him and he's dead. No, he isn't. Believe it. He's alive and he's going to rescue us. I knew she was talking nonsense, deliberately, to help me, but it still helped. He'd better hurry. He's got about 3 seconds to come bursting in. No time for more. I was going first. I couldn't bear to say goodbye in front of Dr. Skinner, so I tried to smile at everything I felt. I was beginning to feel woozy. Skinner whirled me into the trolley. The ceiling started to go by. I thought about the pilot who'd pulled out of that nosedive. I thought about everyone who had died in the plane crash. I thought about the other teenagers in the world, children, lots of them younger than me, who had to lie on a trolley with the ceiling going by on their way to have terrible things done to them. Children in real hospitals where the doctors were good and kind, but sometimes that made no difference. Sometimes terrible things happened anyway. The children had to be brave. I could be brave too. But most of all, I thought about Miranda. Then I was in another room with green walls and bright lights. I was on stage again. A plastic mask was put over my face. I heard Dr. Franklin's calm, smooth voice telling me to count backward from 10. A great adventure, I thought. Exciting. Here I go. Alright. Next we will read Chapter 7, probably through, let me see. Let's say, oh, Chapter 7 is long. So maybe just Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. Yeah, Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 is what we'll do next. This book is as good as I remembered it to be.